In May 1945, an American soldier stood alone at the top of a 400-foot cliff. Around him, the bodies of his fallen comrades lay scattered across shattered rock and torn earth. Below, the rest of his unit had retreated. The order had been clear: fall back. The position was lost. He didn't move. Not because he was reckless, not because he didn't understand the danger. He understood it perfectly. He had been living inside it for weeks. Men had been dying beside him every single day in ways that would haunt anyone for the rest of their life. He stayed because there were still men breathing up there, wounded, unable to move, and in his mind, leaving them behind was simply not something he was capable of doing. What he did next, alone, in the dark, under active enemy fire, for 5 straight hours, was so extraordinary that when the army tried to count the men he saved, they couldn't agree on the number. The official citation settled on 75. Doss himself said it couldn't have been more than 50. He didn't think he'd had enough time. His name was Desmond Doss. He was 26 years old. He had never fired a weapon in his life. He didn't even carry one. The 2016 film Hacksaw Ridge told part of his story, but only part. This is the rest. To understand what Desmond Doss did on that ridge, you first need to understand where the world was in the spring of 1945 and what was at stake on a small island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. By April of 1945, the war in Europe was nearly over. Adolf Hitler was dead by his own hand inside a Berlin bunker. Germany would surrender within days. For the Allies, the European chapter of the Second World War was closing. But in the Pacific, the war was entering its most brutal phase. For 3 years, American forces had been fighting their way across the Pacific Ocean in what military planners called island hopping, seizing one island after another, each one closer to the Japanese mainland: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima. Each battle more costly than the last. Each island defended by Japanese soldiers who fought to the last man with an intensity that stunned even the most battle-hardened American veterans. The Japanese military doctrine of Bushido, the way of the warrior, considered surrender to be the ultimate disgrace. Death in battle was not a tragedy, it was an honor. This created an enemy unlike anything American soldiers had encountered in Europe. On Saipan, Japanese civilians jumped from cliffs by the thousands rather than surrender to American forces. On Iwo Jima, of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner. The rest died fighting. American military planners were drawing up the most ambitious and terrifying operation of the entire war: Operation Downfall, the full-scale invasion of the Japanese mainland. Projected casualties were staggering. Military estimates suggested that an invasion of Japan could cost between 250,000 and 1 million American lives. Some estimates for total casualties, American and Japanese combined, including Japanese civilians, ran as high as 10 million. But before any invasion of Japan could happen, the Allies needed a staging ground, a base close enough to the mainland to support the massive air and naval operations that would precede any landing. They chose Okinawa. Okinawa sits in the Ryukyu Islands chain, roughly 340 miles southwest of mainland Japan. In 1945, it was home to approximately 450,000 civilians. Okinawans, who were culturally and linguistically distinct from the Japanese mainland, many of whom had little desire to die for an empire that had only formally annexed their islands decades earlier. The operation to take Okinawa was codenamed Operation Iceberg. It would become the largest amphibious assault in the entire Pacific theater of the war. Over 180,000 American ground troops, more than 1,600 naval vessels, the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the most powerful naval armada ever assembled, positioned offshore. The commander of American ground forces was Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., son of a Confederate general from the Civil War. He was methodical, cautious, and experienced. His plan called for a two-corps assault along the central beaches, splitting the island in two before sweeping north and south to clear remaining resistance. Military intelligence estimated Japanese troop strength at between 50,000 and 70,000 men. They were off by nearly double. The Japanese had 130,000 troops on Okinawa, but more importantly, they had a plan unlike anything the Americans had faced before. The commander of Japanese forces was Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, a quiet, methodical man who had studied every previous American amphibious operation in the Pacific and drawn a clear conclusion. Meeting the Americans on the beaches was suicide. American naval and air firepower was simply too overwhelming. So Ushijima did something radical. He pulled his forces away from the beaches entirely. Instead of defending the coast, he concentrated his army in the rugged, cave-riddled hills of southern Okinawa and ordered them to dig in. Tunnels, bunkers, underground command posts, interlocking fields of fire designed so that every approach to every defensive position was covered by at least two other defensive positions. Artillery zeroed in on every possible avenue of advance. His strategy was not to win. He knew that was impossible. His strategy was to bleed the Americans so badly, to make the cost of taking Okinawa so horrific, that American public opinion would fracture and force the United States to negotiate a peace settlement rather than invade the mainland. It very nearly worked. On April 1st, 1945, April Fool's Day, a coincidence not lost on the men going ashore, the first waves of American troops landed on Okinawa's western beaches. They met almost no resistance. Soldiers walked ashore expecting carnage and found nothing. Some thought it was a trick. Some thought the intelligence had been completely wrong and the Japanese had evacuated. They hadn't. They were waiting. While American forces were beginning to work their way south into Ushijima's killing ground, among the hundreds of thousands of men on that island was a young medic from rural Virginia who had spent most of the previous 2 years fighting a different kind of battle, one against his own army. Desmond Thomas Doss was born on February 7, 1919, in Lynchburg, Virginia, the second of 3 children. His father, William, was a carpenter. His mother, Bertha, was deeply religious, a committed member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, one of the more doctrinally strict Protestant denominations in America. The Adventist faith shaped Desmond profoundly from childhood. The 10 Commandments weren't abstract principles to him. They were literal rules for living. "Thou shalt not kill" meant exactly what it said. Not in wartime, not in self-defense, not ever. The Sabbath was observed from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday without exception. These weren't guidelines. They were the architecture of his entire moral world. Growing up in Depression-era Virginia, Doss developed a quiet, stubborn integrity that would define everything he did for the rest of his life. He wasn't loud about his beliefs. He didn't lecture people. He simply lived them and refused, with remarkable calmness, to deviate from them regardless of the pressure applied. There was an incident in his childhood that he would later describe as formative. On his bedroom wall hung an illustrated copy of the 10 Commandments, a picture showing Cain standing over the body of Abel, a brother killing a brother. As a child, Desmond stared at that image often. He made a private decision. He would never be the person holding the weapon. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Doss was working at the Newport News Naval Shipyard in Virginia, building ships for the war effort. His job gave him an occupational deferment from the draft. His religious beliefs would have given him a conscientious objector status that kept him entirely out of uniform. He didn't want either. He wanted to serve. He genuinely loved his country. He simply believed, with complete sincerity, that he could serve it without killing anyone. He applied to the Army as a non-combatant, requesting assignment as a medic, someone who would go into the fight, but whose job was to preserve life rather than take it. The Army was not enthusiastic about this arrangement. Basic training at Camp Lee in Virginia was a misery. Doss refused to handle a rifle during weapons training. He refused duties on Saturday. He read his Bible every night. He was relentlessly mocked. Fellow soldiers called him a coward, a freak, a religious nut. Some of his barracks mates physically beat him on at least one occasion, trying to drive him out. They threw boots at him while he prayed. He never retaliated. He never complained to officers. He kept praying. His commanding officers tried multiple times to have him discharged or transferred. Captain Jack Glover, who would later become one of Doss's most ardent defenders, initially wanted him out of the unit entirely, convinced that a soldier who wouldn't carry a weapon was a liability that would get men killed. The pressure intensified when Doss's unit was preparing for deployment. Officers attempted to initiate a Section 8 discharge, a psychiatric discharge, arguing that his religious convictions made him unfit for military service. Doss was eventually brought before a court-martial. He refused to accept a discharge. He refused to plead guilty to insubordination. He stood before the military court and argued, quietly, without theatrics, that his right to practice his religion was protected by the United States Constitution, and that his willingness to serve as a medic in combat, unarmed, demonstrated more commitment to his country than any soldier who let a desk exemption keep him home. A letter arrived during the proceedings from a brigadier general who had served with Doss's father, confirming that Doss's pacifism was constitutionally protected. The charges were dropped. He was going to war on his terms. The men who had tormented him in training were about to discover something. In actual combat, the man who runs toward the wounded under fire, without a weapon, without the ability to shoot back, is not the coward. He is the bravest man on the battlefield. Doss proved this first in Guam in 1944, where he treated wounded soldiers under direct enemy fire and earned a Bronze Star for valor. Then again in the Philippines at Leyte, where he earned a second Bronze Star. By the time his unit boarded ships for Okinawa, the men who had thrown boots at him in basic training were asking, quietly, among themselves, whether Doss would be there with them. They wanted him there. Unarmed, Bible-carrying Desmond Doss had become one of the most trusted men in the 307th Infantry Regiment. None of them knew yet what he was about to do. April and May of 1945 on Okinawa were among the most terrible months in American military history. The early days of the invasion had been deceptively quiet in the north. American forces swept through the northern two-thirds of the island in under 2 weeks, meeting scattered resistance. Some soldiers began to wonder if this was going to be easier than Iwo Jima. Then they turned south. The 77th Infantry Division, Doss's division, was assigned to the southern sector, where Ushijima's forces had constructed their primary defensive lines. The geography was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. The landscape of southern Okinawa is a series of ridges, escarpments, and hills cut through with ravines and honeycombed with natural caves that the Japanese had expanded into elaborate underground fortresses. Each ridge had a name: Sugarloaf Hill, Half Moon, Horseshoe, Wana Ridge, Wana Draw, Conical Hill, the Pimple. They sound almost peaceful until you understand that each one represented days of brutal close quarters, fighting in mud and rain, with artillery falling constantly and snipers positioned in every cave mouth and tree line. The weather made everything worse. Spring rains turned the terrain into a sea of mud. Tanks bogged down, supply lines broke. Men fought and bled and died in conditions that were, in the truest sense of the word, medieval, close enough to see the enemy's face, far enough from help that a wounded man could die waiting for a medic. Doss was that medic. Day after day, he moved through the chaos. While every other soldier's instinct was to find cover, to get low, get behind something solid, stay alive, Doss moved toward the sound of screaming. He crawled through open ground under fire to reach men who had been hit. He dragged them back. He dressed wounds with Japanese bullets hitting the dirt inches away. He never carried a weapon. He never shot back. He simply kept moving toward whoever needed him. His fellow soldiers watched this with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Some admitted later that they assumed he would die in the first week, that a man who refused to carry a rifle couldn't survive in this environment. They were wrong. There is something almost inexplicable about Doss on the battlefield, something that went beyond physical courage. Other medics also showed extraordinary bravery, but Doss had a quality that his fellow soldiers consistently described in the same way, a complete, unshakable calm. He didn't seem afraid, not in the way other men were afraid. It was as though his faith had genuinely removed the concept of self-preservation from his decision-making. Every choice he made was about the man in front of him, not about himself. Captain Glover, the same officer who had wanted Doss discharged before the war, would later say of this period, "He was one of the bravest persons alive." Coming from a man who had tried to have him removed from his unit, those words carry particular weight. As May began, Doss's battalion was assigned to one of the most strategically critical and most dangerous positions on the entire front, a place the soldiers called Hacksaw Ridge. Its formal name was the Maeda Escarpment. It was a coral limestone ridge in the Uraso-Mura district of southern Okinawa. From a distance, it looked almost unremarkable, just another ridge in a landscape full of ridges. Up close, it was a vertical wall of rock, roughly 400 feet from base to summit. The top 35 feet overhung the face of the cliff, meaning that the last section of any ascent had to be made with cargo nets, hands reaching over a lip of rock, while artillery fell and machine guns swept the top. The Japanese had been fortifying Hacksaw Ridge for months. Tunnels ran through the escarpment from one end to the other. Machine gun emplacements were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire covering every approach. Mortars were pre-sighted on the cargo nets, on the plateau at the top, on the routes soldiers would take trying to advance. The men defending it were from some of Japan's most experienced units. Soldiers who had been fighting since China, who knew how to use terrain, who were prepared to die where they stood. The first American assaults on the Maeda Escarpment were catastrophic. Company A of the 307th Infantry went up the cargo nets and was nearly annihilated. The survivors came back down, carrying or dragging their wounded, leaving behind the men they couldn't reach. Artillery fire was constant. Japanese soldiers had become so skilled at the tunnels that they could move men and weapons from one part of the ridge to another without ever exposing themselves to American fire. On May 2nd, it was Company B's turn. Doss climbed the cargo nets with them. For the next 3 days, soldiers fought yard by yard across the top of the escarpment. Japanese machine gun fire was so intense, so perfectly zeroed in, that men died before they could take cover. 1G, I was decapitated by a burst of fire as he crested the ridge. The fighting was close enough that soldiers could hear Japanese commands from the tunnel entrances. Doss moved through all of it without a weapon, treating the wounded, dragging men back from exposed positions, praying quietly as he worked. On May 5th, the situation became untenable. Japanese counterattacks had pushed the Americans back nearly to the edge of the escarpment. The battalion commander made the call. "Pull back. Every man retreats. Come back down the cargo nets. Reorganize and try again." The order went out. Men began falling back. Doss looked around him at the top of that cliff. Approximately 75 men lay wounded across the plateau, men who had been hit too badly to move on their own, men who would be left behind. He didn't follow the order. He couldn't. What followed was 5 hours that no official military document can fully capture, because no one was there to witness all of it. There were no cameras, no journalists, just Desmond Doss, alone at the top of a 400-foot cliff, with 75 wounded men and an unknown number of Japanese soldiers somewhere in the darkness beyond the ridge. He started with the man closest to him. Doss had trained as a medic, but he was not performing medical miracles that night. There was no surgical equipment, no blood supply, no hospital. What he could do was stabilize wounds, stop bleeding, and move men to the edge of the escarpment where they could be lowered to safety and reach actual medical care. Moving them was the problem. A wounded man who cannot walk cannot be carried by one person across open ground under fire, not for any meaningful distance. Doss improvised. He used a loop knot he had learned years earlier, a simple but effective configuration that allowed him to secure a rope around a man's torso without cutting off circulation to wounded limbs. He found a tree stump near the edge of the escarpment and used it as an anchor point. He dragged the first man to the edge, secured the rope, lowered him down the 400-foot face of the cliff, then went back for the next one, and the next one, and the next. The night was not quiet. Japanese forces were active on the escarpment, probing, moving through the tunnels, firing at movement. Every time Doss moved across the open plateau, he was potentially visible to enemy soldiers who would have killed him without hesitation. He moved anyway. The men below could hear the rope moving over the edge of the cliff, a steady, rhythmic sound in the darkness. And they began to understand what was happening above them. One soldier who witnessed men arriving at the base of the cliff that night later described it simply. They came down one at a time, in the dark, and none of them should have made it. Inside his own mind, Doss was not performing calculations. He was not thinking about heroism or medals or legacy. By his own account, given in interviews years later, he had reduced the entire situation to a single repeating thought, a prayer he said between each man. "Lord, help me get one more, just one more." One more became 2, 2 became 10, 10 became 20. The rope kept moving. How long this went on is difficult to establish precisely. The accounts of survivors differ on the timing. What is consistent across every account is the duration. Several hours in darkness under conditions that should have killed him multiple times over. When it was over, when Doss had finally reached every man he could find alive on the plateau, he came down the cargo nets himself. The army tried to count the men he had saved. It was harder than it sounds. Some men had been moved by others before Doss reached them. Some had died despite being lowered. The initial estimates ran as high as 100. General A.D. Bruce, the 77th Division commander, heard the account that night and was so stunned that he immediately began preparing paperwork for a Medal of Honor. Doss refused the higher numbers. He was characteristically precise and characteristically humble. "It couldn't have been more than 50, he said. "I wouldn't have had the time for 100. The Army split the difference. The Medal of Honor citation reads, 75. But the story wasn't over. Doss remained with his unit on Okinawa. The fighting on the Maeda Escarpment continued for weeks. He was there for all of it, still unarmed, still moving toward the wounded, still operating with that unsettling calm that made other soldiers describe him in almost mystical terms. On May 21st, during a nighttime raid, Doss was sheltering in a shell hole with two other soldiers when a Japanese grenade landed among them. He had a fraction of a second to react. He tried to kick it away. The explosion tore shrapnel into both his legs, with fragments reaching as far as his hip. He was badly wounded, badly enough that he should have been evacuated immediately. He treated his own wounds. Then he waited for 5 hours, while the firefight continued around him, refusing to call for help because he didn't want to expose litter bearers to enemy fire on his behalf. When litter bearers finally reached him, he told them to take another wounded man first. While being carried back on the stretcher, a sniper's bullet hit him in the arm, shattering the bone. Doss rolled off the stretcher, told the bearers to go help someone else, and used a broken rifle stock as a splint on his own shattered arm. Then he crawled 300 yards under fire to reach the aid station. He was evacuated on May 21st, 1945, aboard the USS Mercy. His active combat duty was over. In total, Doss had been wounded 4 times on Okinawa. He had 17 pieces of shrapnel in his body. His left arm was broken. He had saved an estimated 75 men, and he had never, not once, in the entire war, fired a weapon at another human being. While Doss was being evacuated, the Battle of Okinawa still had nearly a month to run. General Ushijima's strategy of bleeding the Americans had worked, partially. The battle that American planners had projected would last 2 weeks had stretched past 3 months. The cost was staggering. American casualties on Okinawa reached nearly 50,000, including over 12,500 killed. The U.S. Navy suffered its highest casualties of the entire Pacific War, largely due to the kamikaze campaign. Japanese pilots flying aircraft loaded with explosives and deliberately crashing them into American ships had, by this point in the war, become the primary Japanese naval strategy. At Okinawa, over 1,900 kamikaze missions were flown. Nearly 400 American ships were hit. 36 were sunk. The psychological impact on American sailors, watching aircraft deliberately aimed at them, knowing the pilot intended to die, was profound and lasting. On the ground, the fighting in southern Okinawa had taken on a particular horror. The combination of intense Japanese resistance, difficult terrain, and constant rain had created conditions that veterans would describe, for the rest of their lives, as unlike anything they had experienced elsewhere in the war. The mud was everywhere. Deep, red-brown mud that clung to everything, that filled foxholes overnight, that turned every attempt to move equipment into an ordeal. The smell of the battlefield, of decomposing bodies, of smoke, of the particular chemical smell of artillery, permeated everything. The civilian population of Okinawa suffered terribly. Caught between 2 armies, Okinawan civilians died by the tens of thousands. Some killed directly in the fighting, some by Japanese soldiers who executed anyone they suspected of cooperation with the Americans, some by mass suicide driven by Japanese propaganda that convinced civilians American soldiers would torture and kill them. Estimates of Okinawan civilian deaths range from 40,000 to 150,000, a staggering range that reflects the chaos and the difficulty of accounting for deaths across a 3-month battle that consumed an entire island. General Simon Bolivar Buchner did not survive the battle. On June 18, 1945, 4 days before the island was declared secure, he was observing frontline operations from a forward position when Japanese artillery struck nearby. A fragment of coral rock, blasted loose by the explosion, struck him in the chest. He died within minutes, becoming the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in the entire Second World War. Ushijima committed ritual suicide, seppuku, on June 22, 1945, as American forces closed in on his final command post. His final order to his remaining troops was simply, "Fight to the last." The island was declared secure on June 22, 1945. The final tally, over 110,000 Japanese soldiers killed, an estimated 11,000 taken prisoner, a higher ratio than at Iwo Jima, partly reflecting the exhaustion and hopelessness of the final weeks. American losses totaled nearly 50,000 casualties. More American soldiers, sailors, and airmen were killed or wounded at Okinawa than in any other single operation in the Pacific War. And those numbers, those enormous, almost incomprehensible numbers, are part of why the decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 was made. The men responsible for planning Operation Downfall, the invasion of mainland Japan, looked at what Okinawa had cost and projected those casualty rates forward onto an island 20 times larger, defended by a population that had been told to fight to the last man, woman, and child. The mathematics were unbearable. 2 atomic bombs ended the war before that invasion happened. Whether that decision was right, whether the lives saved by avoiding the invasion outweighed the lives taken by the bombs, is one of the most debated questions in all of modern history. But what is not debated is the chain of events. Okinawa demonstrated beyond any doubt the cost of invading Japan, and that demonstration changed the calculus of everything that followed. 82 days, nearly 200,000 dead on all sides, an island destroyed, and somewhere on a hospital ship in the Pacific, a young man from Lynchburg, Virginia, with 17 pieces of shrapnel in his body and a shattered arm, was beginning the long journey home. Desmond Doss returned to the United States in October 1945. On the 12th of that month, he was brought to the White House in Washington, D.C. President Harry S. Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. Truman, a veteran of the First World War, a man who had seen combat and understood what the medal represented, looked at Doss and said words that have been quoted ever since: "I would rather have this medal than be president." Doss became the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor. He received it not for killing, but for saving, over and over again, under conditions that would have broken most men, in a battle that is still studied in military academies as one of the most brutal in modern warfare. The return to civilian life was not easy. The wounds Doss had sustained, the shrapnel, the broken arm, the physical toll of months of combat in tropical conditions, were only part of it. In the years after the war, he developed tuberculosis, which he had almost certainly contracted during the fighting. The disease progressed severely. His left lung had to be surgically removed. 5 ribs were taken out with it. For years, he lived in hospitals and sanitariums, fighting the same quiet, stubborn battle he had fought on Hacksaw Ridge, one day at a time, trusting that it was worth continuing. He could no longer do physical work. The carpenter's apprentice, the shipyard worker, the man who had climbed cargo nets up a 400-foot cliff, was now a man who moved carefully and tired easily. He returned to Lynchburg. He worked his small farm as best he could. He spent time with his church. He gave talks, quietly, reluctantly, about his experiences, always careful to direct the credit toward God rather than himself. He resisted, for decades, every attempt to make a movie about his life. He was not interested in fame. He was not interested in being a symbol. He was Desmond Doss, a man who had made a decision, stuck to it, and come home. It wasn't until 2001 when a filmmaker named Gregory Crosby finally convinced him that his story deserved to be preserved, that Doss agreed to cooperate with the project that would eventually become the 2016 film Hacksaw Ridge, directed by Mel Gibson, with Andrew Garfield portraying Doss. Garfield received an Academy Award nomination for the role. The film grossed over $180 million worldwide. Doss died on March 23, 2006. He was 87 years old. He is buried at the Chattanooga National Cemetery in Tennessee, among the men and women who gave their service to their country. There is one final detail about Desmond Doss that the film touched on only briefly, and that deserves to be told properly. During the chaos of the fighting on Hacksaw Ridge, Doss had lost his Bible. The small, worn Bible he had carried from Lynchburg to the Pacific, the same one he read every night in barracks while other soldiers threw boots at him, had been left behind somewhere on the Maeda Escarpment. When the men of the 307th Infantry found out, they went back. After the battle was won, after Okinawa was secure, men who had once mocked Desmond Doss for being a religious nut, who had beaten him in basic training, who had wanted him out of their unit, they returned to the shattered terrain of Hacksaw Ridge and searched until they found it. Then they mailed it home to him. No order was given. No officer commanded it. The men simply decided among themselves that the Bible belonged to Doss, and that getting it back to him was the right thing to do. Some stories about war are about what human beings are capable of doing to each other. This one is about what they are capable of doing for each other. The Battle of Okinawa lasted 82 days and changed the course of the Second World War. Desmond Doss spent most of those days doing something that, by any rational calculation, should have killed him, and came home with a Medal of Honor and 17 pieces of shrapnel and a borrowed rifle stock that had once been his splint. He never fired a weapon. He never wanted to. If this story is the kind of history you want more of, the stories that go deeper than the textbooks, the men and moments that defined the war and the world we live in, subscribe to this channel. Every week we bring you the history that deserves to be remembered, and if this video moved you, share it. These stories exist because someone decided they were worth keeping. Help us keep them.